Volodymyr Zelensky agreed to make a compromise to end the war. Donald Trump made such a loud statement the day before, after which the media reported that Zelensky supposedly agreed to give Donbas to the Russians and withdraw the armed forces of Ukraine from there, in exchange for a deal with the United States, which would secure the allocation of $800 billion for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and a free economic zone would be created in Donbas. Ukraine would also reportedly get United States security guarantees and European troops stationed on our territory. And even duty-free trade with America looks like a super offer. This package is now being discussed in Abu Dhabi by Ukrainian, American and Russian delegations. All would be fine, except after Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin in Moscow. The Kremlin stated that ending the aggression in Ukraine is only possible if an agreement is reached based on the arrangements made between Trump and Putin in Anchorage. This is a complete surrender of Ukrainian territories to Russia. And so, putting the two pieces of the puzzle together, some Ukrainian media suddenly started writing that actually the war could have ended back in August of last year. Since Zelensky eventually came to what the Russians were saying in August, that is, to the very same Ankara formula. But that's fundamentally not the case, and the Reuters information that Ukrainian journalists are referring to isn't about that at all. Reuters tried to explain what the Ankara formula is, and they stated that Putin insists on the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine from Donetsk and Luhansk regions. He said this back in August of last year. And now, according to Corriere della Sera, Zelensky agrees to give up that very Donbas in exchange for money and guarantees. These two pieces supposedly fit together, and it's said the war could have ended this way in August last year. So let's break everything down and answer the main question. Did Volodymyr Zelensky really sell Donbas for $800 billion? My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's dive into this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, write any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we get breaking news as it comes in. So, Volodymyr Zelensky exchanged Donbas for security guarantees and money. An article with this title was published today in the publication Corriere della Sera, which reveals the essence and subject of today's negotiations in Abu Dhabi. Donald Trump, after negotiations with Zelensky in Davos, stated, quote, "Volodymyr Zelensky is ready to sign the agreement. He told me about it. The terms of the agreement on Ukraine have been coordinated, and he is ready for a compromise." And this information has generated a lot of rumors and speculation. But we are here with you to set everything straight. Corriere della Sera writes that Volodymyr Zelensky hesitated before confirming his trip to Davos for the Economic Forum, because the story of this war now puts him in a dramatic conflict of conscience. To accept Donald Trump's offer, risking that his promises will turn out to be empty and lead to disaster, or to continue the war, which may be claiming the lives of more than 100,000 people and creating inhumane conditions for millions of Ukrainians in Ukraine. And by the way, Donald Trump just recently said, "I admire Ukrainians because I don't understand how they survive in such conditions when it's freezing outside and the Russians are hitting the energy infrastructure and there's no heating in the houses." And then comes the Corriere. Della Sera writes that from the ongoing meetings, it is already becoming clear that something is happening. Yesterday at the World Economic Forum, Zelensky spoke with Trump for an hour. Both left without a gloomy expression. The documents were not signed, but there was no discord either, and Zelensky appeared open. He stated, "We are on the home stretch, which is always very difficult, but today was a positive day." In addition, let me remind you, on Tuesday in Davos, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with Kirill Dmitriev, who is Vladimir Putin's negotiator. After meeting with these two, Witkoff and Kushner attended the talks between Trump and Zelensky and then flew to Moscow for a meeting with Putin. By the morning of January 23rd, the Americans had flown to Abu Dhabi for the first direct negotiations. The Kiev delegation is led by Kirill Budanov, head of the president's office and former Ukrainian intelligence chief. The Russian delegation is led by Dmitriev and Russian military intelligence head Igor Kostyukov. Now we reach the key point, Dmitriev's career in negotiations with Dmitriev. The negotiators are carrying at least 4 different documents in their portfolios, which are theoretically supposed to make up the peace agreement. The first is the so-called founding text of the entire package, followed by 3 key parts. The most dangerous part for Zelensky is essentially related to handing over part of Donbas to Russia, which Putin claims. The territory will supposedly be handed over only de facto but not de jure, and here is the quote. For Zelensky, this concession could prove fatal, as Ukrainian public opinion is against it. And by giving up the Donetsk fortifications, he will be under threat of new Russian offensives across the vast plain toward Dnipro and Odessa. This would be the end of independent Ukraine, as the country would lose access to the Black Sea and would need Russia's approval for exports. The United States is offering him 2 concessions to help him deal with this enormous risk. One document details a plan for public and private funding totaling $800 billion for the restoration and revival of Ukraine, initiated by Larry Fink, the head of the fund. In the second document, Kyiv will be provided with American security guarantees in support of the European troops who will have to enter the territory of Ukraine. Zelensky will have to cede territory in exchange for Western money and defense. But here a whole lot of questions arise that need to be addressed. For example, Finnish President Alexei Stubb reports that there is a document about the sequence, and this is the main and key document at this stage of the negotiations. What is meant is that Ukraine is being offered to give up Donbas first, and only then receive guarantees and money, while Ukraine is demanding the opposite sequence. And supposedly this document states that first Donbas is given up, and then the Americans guarantee to sign those documents that provide guarantees and money for reconstruction. The same Stubb said that the $800 billion reconstruction plan exists only on paper for now, and there is no real money. It's also unclear whether Putin will accept security guarantees that include the deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine. But when there are still no answers to these last 2 questions, America is already demanding that we agree to surrender Donbas. And supposedly, this document about the sequence states that, believe me, everything will be fine later. And let me note right away that there's no big sensation in this material. You have to understand, nothing is really new here. This kind of question is typical for DLSR's career. It basically started from Geneva, when Ukraine and Europe, during negotiations with Marco Rubio on November 23rd, managed to remove all the unacceptable provisions from the original 28 points written by the Russians, and trim the plan to 20 points. Since then, for 2 months, Zelensky and the negotiation team tried to change Donald Trump's position on Donbas. These were the moments when Trump and Zelensky said the agreement was 90% ready with only 10% left, specifically about Donbas. Ukrainians tried to change Trump's stance during talks with Witkoff in Berlin, in person at Mar-a-Lago and elsewhere. At the same time, Ukraine and Europe, at dozens of coalition meetings, tried to get reasonable security guarantees from the United States, and those very recovery packages, like they say now, worth $800 billion. And so, in the end, it seems they failed to change Donald Trump's position on Donbas, but they more or less managed to get reasonable security guarantees and recovery packages. But there's a nuance here, and I've mentioned this more than once in my episodes. The idea was for Donald Trump to sign off on the security guarantees and the $800 billion recovery package right at Davos during the Economic Forum. With those signatures, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner were set to fly to Moscow to meet Putin. That is, the idea was to proceed from this point, that the guarantees had already been signed, the recovery package for Ukraine had been signed, even if only preliminarily, but Trump did not sign those documents. And now, at the negotiations in Abu Dhabi, Ukraine found itself in a situation where the documents on security guarantees and the $800 billion recovery package were basically ready, but there were no signatures from the United States on them. And here, a deadlock arises. Ukraine says it is ready to discuss the issue of Donbas, no matter how bitter it may be, but only when there are already signed documents on guarantees and money. But Trump suggests a different sequence, and that's why President Stubb of Finland's clarification about the document on the sequence is important. Supposedly, in it, the United States actually promises to sign documents on guarantees and money right after Ukraine signs off on giving up Donbas. As a result, here's what happens. Ukraine can't talk about Donbas right now because the United States still only gives verbal guarantees, not written ones, and the United States isn't signing those very documents. Because Putin won't agree to the presence of Western troops in Ukraine, which is mentioned in the Declaration of the Coalition of the Willing. It's a complicated puzzle. After Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with Putin in the Kremlin, they presented their conditions. Following the meeting, the assistant to the head of the Russian Federation, Yuri Ushakov, noted that the only way to agree on a long-term peace is to resolve the territorial issue according to the Anchorage formula, which provides for the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Donetsk region. At the same time, Ushakov continued to lie, claiming that Russians are supposedly genuinely interested in resolving the war in Ukraine through diplomatic means. Here is a quote, "But so far, this hasn't happened. Russia will continue to consistently pursue the goals set before the special military operation, specifically goals on the battlefield, where Russian forces have the strategic initiative. And after all of this..." Reuters explained what the Anchorage formula is, which Ushakov mentioned to us. The main point of this formula, as a source close to the Kremlin told the agency, is the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine from the territory of the Donetsk region that they are currently holding, so that the Russian Federation would gain full control over them and the occupiers. In exchange, the Russians promised to freeze the current front line in the south and east, meaning the Ukrainian armed forces withdraw from Donbas and the Russians freeze the remaining front line. And here, Ukrainian media went a little crazy today when they started writing that supposedly, under such conditions, the war could have ended back in August. Since, according to Corriere della Sera, Zelensky is supposedly agreeing to what was in the Anchorage formula at the moment, and my colleagues are referring specifically to the Reuters article. The thing is, if you read the original article in English, there's nothing like that in Reuters. There's not a word there about the war possibly ending, or why it couldn't end, because the Anchorage formula is exactly those same 28 points of the peace plan that were later outlined in the Witkov-Dmitriev plan, which we learned about in October. And then this plan was revised by the Ukrainian delegation together with the American one, and they ended up with 20 points. And it was exactly this plan, or the Anchorage formula, that has been revised over these past months, and that's how they negotiated those very security guarantees and the document on Ukraine's reconstruction for $800 billion. That's why it's very strange to read in the Ukrainian media today that the war could have ended in August of last year. This narrative is very dangerous because it creates the impression that if it weren't for Ukraine, if it weren't for Zelensky, the war would have ended a long time ago. It could have all been ended back in August of last year under the terms of the Anchorage formula. That's complete nonsense and not mentioned in Reuters at all. That's why negotiations are unfolding like this. As you can see, there are still a lot of unfinished issues, a lot of things that all sides can't agree on yet, and well, it all comes down to the question of security. So for now, I'll leave it at that. Let's wait for the results of the negotiations in Abu Dhabi, and let's talk about this topic again, but in one of the next episodes. For now, friends, share your opinions and thoughts on this topic in the comments below this episode if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, if this episode was interesting for you, and if I managed to explain everything clearly. You can do this by donating or subscribing using the provided links and details. In the description of this video it says support the channel Alexei Pechi. Use any format you prefer. Thanks for your support and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the description. That's all for now. Take care and goodbye.